In the 1960s, World War III seemed inevitable, and as the Soviet bombers screamed across the skies and missiles rained down from the heavens, their first targets would be NATO airfields. With this on everyone's mind, the question became how to strike back, and from that conundrum, a legend was born. The Harrier has graced the skies for over 50 years. In that time, it has gone from roaring dogfights over the South Atlantic to performing danger close missions in support of troops in combat and dropping precision-guided munitions on pinpoint targets in the Middle East. The jump jet has seen many iterations, but for this I'm going to separate it into three: Generation 1, Generation 2, and the Sea Harriers. The GR-1 entered service in 1969 with the RAF, and the US Marine Corps would adopt the Aviate-A in 1971. These early Harriers were relatively simple aircraft lacking any form of radar. Additionally, they were reasonably light and slow in the era of Phantoms and MiG-23s. Because of this, the Harrier had many detractors, which wasn't helped by a fairly poor safety record, with 1 in 3 pilots having ejected from the jet at some point. However, the Harrier would prove itself invaluable again and again, with the first instance of this in 1975. With fears of a Guatemalan invasion into Belize and no airfield big enough to operate conventional jets, 6 Harriers would fly directly to Belize to discourage any aggression. Despite not seeing any combat, this proved that the Harrier had a place in the supersonic age. During the 70s and 80s, the RAF Harriers would spend most of their time in Germany, operating from dispersed fields. In these operations, Harriers deployed in small groups hidden in the German countryside. The aircraft would take off from a small field and land vertically on landing pads. These strips would be determined as suitable by being able to be driven over by a Land Rover at 40 miles an hour without losing control to determine the roughness, and a measuring device known as a pogo stick was used to determine firmness. These operations would be done in complete radio silence unless there was an emergency. With the lack of sensors and no ATC, it was a hell of a task for the pilots to find these bases due to their purpose of being completely hidden. Additionally to this, the Harrier force would become proficient in ship operations, an ability that would become a staple of Harrier operations in the future, and would bring in many other operators. In 1978, the last conventional Royal Navy aircraft carrier would leave service, as the British government had decided that the aircraft carrier was obsolete, just as they did with manned aircraft years before. However, 3 new through-deck cruisers were being built in the 70s, starting off as essentially anti-submarine helicopter carriers armed with missiles. But over time, these ships would adapt to carrying Harriers, but at the start of their careers, they were specialised ASW platforms that had a few Harriers on board as a deterrent. The aircraft on board would be the new Sea Harrier FRS-1, a design from the ground-up fighter compared to its RAF sisters, who were ground attackers who could dogfight if they needed to. The Sea Harrier differed in having a raised cockpit for better visibility and, more importantly, the Blue Fox radar, which would allow the jet to detect air targets at a distance and even find and target shipping. In the freezing weather of the South Atlantic in 1982, the Harrier would become a household name. On the 2nd of April 1982, Argentine forces assaulted the Falkland Islands, expecting an easy political win during a turbulent time for their ruling class. However, the British response was a task force that set sail, including ships from the Royal Navy, Royal Fleet Auxiliary, and dozens of merchant ships carrying troops, helicopters, and most importantly, Harriers of both the Sea Harrier and GR3 variety. Upon reaching the Falklands, the Harriers would perform a variety of operations. One such being the bombing of Port Stanley, where a flight of Sea Harriers would fly in at low level and drop a mixture of cluster munitions and 1,000-pound bombs, and then would exit at low altitude. Although the airfield was not put out of operation, something that the pilots were already expecting due to the lack of effectiveness of the weapons when delivered low and flat, the raid was still considered a success at dampening Argentine morale. The most regular operations flown by Sea Harriers were combat air patrols. Despite facing superior aircraft, the Harrier performed excellently, with 20 shootdowns to no losses in air-to-air combat. There was, however, losses to ground fire. This was thanks a lot to the skill of the pilots, but also to the American-supplied AIM-9L Sidewinder that had been hastily delivered. Although the Sea Harriers did have a radar, it was small and the jets would rely on guidance from ships of the fleet who were sat in the bay. This drastically reduced the early warning capability, which in combination with daring low-level tactics of the Argentine pilots meant that multiple aircraft managed to deliver weapons and sink British ships. While the Sea Harriers protected the air, GR3s would be used in support of troops on the ground. The next big step in the Harrier story happens in 1985 with the introduction of the Aviation to the US Marine Corps, a new breed of jump jet, the Harrier II. The story of the Harrier II begins with both the RAF and the US Marine Corps looking to improve on the basic Harrier. The RAF were looking to improve the speed and payload, while the US Marine Corps wanted to increase the stability of the hover and increase the payload. Although wanting slightly different things, it was decided to go with the US Marine Corps aircraft, which, although slower by about 80 knots than the Generation 1 Harrier, it had additional weapon pylons and significantly more fuel. This turned the jet from a true seat-of-the-pants hot rod to a computerized attacker punching far above its weight. This generation would first prove itself in 1991 in the First Gulf War. Technical issues and the death of a test pilot delayed Harrier readiness in the RAF. This left the US Marine Corps as the sole operator of the Harrier during the First Gulf War. These Marine Corps aircraft would be stationed close to the front line, allowing them to provide quick and constant close air support. Due to this being the day attack variant of the AV-8B, they relied on JTACs and AFACs to find and coordinate strikes. On these missions, the Harriers would carry a wide variety of munitions, from bombs and cluster munitions to napalm and Maverick missiles. The ability of the AV-8B to use CCIP bombing meant that once directed to a target, they could place weapons near enough exactly where they wanted them. Marine commanders prioritized artillery as strike targets, though low-level attacks with unguided munitions resulted in multiple losses. Despite the threat, chiefly from man-pads, the Harrier proved its worth, delivering 7,175 Mark 20 Rockeyes, 288 Mark 83s, 4,167 Mark 82s, and over 83,000 rounds of 25mm ammunition. After the First Gulf War, the Harrier IIs would get the upgrades that really improved their capability in the form of the AV-8B-NA, Harrier GL7, and Harrier II Plus. This gave the Harriers the ability to fight day or night and in all weathers, but arguably most important, the ability to self-designate smart munition, bringing them truly into the current generation. On the side of the Sea Harrier, it would get the FA2 upgrade. This upgraded its engine and radar to the much superior Blue Vixen. This also gave them access to the AIM-120 AMRAAM, as well as other improvements, all working to make it more lethal at longer ranges. The AV-8B2 Plus would essentially take the AV-8B-NA and give it a radar. This also allowed it to carry the AIM-120 AMRAAM. Following UN peacekeeping operations, Harriers would once again return to the desert in support of the global war on terror and the Second Gulf War. Harriers would be used in a variety of roles such as scud hunting, CAS, and interdiction. The jets would employ a wide range of munitions, for example, rockets, Maverick missiles, and guided bombs. This would once again go to prove that the Harrier could keep up in the 21st century, something the British government would disagree with, and would retire the Sea Harrier in 2006 and the GR9 in 2010, 8 years before the replacement would enter service. Another great decision. Although the Harrier wouldn't continue in British service, other operators, including the US Marine Corps, who will retire the next year, have continued to keep the Harrier relevant. I have no doubt that by 2030 there will be no more Harriers in operation, as the Italians and Spanish retire the last of their force. It's clear to see, however, that the legacy of the Harrier still lives on in the form of the F-35B, another V-STOL aircraft that has many detractors, but with it entering service in the United States Marine Corps, RAF, Royal Navy, Italian Navy, Spanish Navy, and the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, I'm certain in 50 years' time we will look back on it as fondly as we do with the Harrier. To finish, I'll say this. One of my earliest memories is seeing the Harrier fly at the Lowestoft Airshow, performing displays I will never forget. Thank you for watching. I'd really appreciate hearing from you about your fondest memories of the Harrier, and if you want more military history videos, please like and subscribe.